much. Thank you for coming back. I hope you had a nice, short bit of caffeine into the veins. It always helps. I'm really looking forward to this session. As we know, I don't need to tell any of you this, but in so many cultures across the world, salmon have had a long and deep connection with us, embedded in culture. And with it comes the cultural loss as salmon slip away, and the question of how can we revive that connection and culture as well. So I'm really delighted that Fawn is going to be rejoining us, and I've also persuaded Elle Adams as well to join us after the next speaker, who is Dr. Lara Stroh. She was born into a fishing family in Germany. She's fly fished all of her life. She is a PhD in quantum physics, and for 10 years has co-organized Europe's largest fly fishing show. And since last year, she's been an ambassador for the Atlantic Salmon Trust. I'm really looking forward to this. So please put your hands together for Lara.
Thank you, Elle, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm going to tell you a little about the loss of the salmon in Germany. I assume many of you will not think of Germany when thinking of the Atlantic salmon. I myself was very surprised when I first heard that the Atlantic salmon could be found in many river systems in Germany until the middle of the last century. In fact, the Rhine was the most important salmon river in the whole of Europe. So I will start my presentation by taking you on a journey into the past. Going through old historical documents, I want to give you an idea about how abundant and how widespread the salmon was in Germany's rivers. So let's jump into the past. As shown by the map I chose, which is of the German Empire from 1871 till 1918. And the river systems that I will cover are the Oder system, the Elbe system, the Weser system, and the Rhine system, which used to be the longest European river habitat of the Atlantic salmon. Just as a note before we start our journey into history, some of the sources that will be named have a slightly more recent date, which is the date when the source was first published, but the date that's of interest to our salmon journey is the one that's given in the texts. So let's start with the oldest and make our way forward in time. In 1419, in the river Aare by Bern. The river Aare is part of the Rhine system, so for the salmon to end up there in Switzerland, they had to first swim through the German part of the Rhine. So in total, they then swam 1,200 kilometers from the North Sea all the way into Switzerland. Konrad Justinger wrote in his Berner Chronicle the following, here an English translation. So he noted that 1419 was a particularly good year for catching salmon, and in the area in and around Bern, more than 3,000 salmon were caught. Next, we jump into the year 1432, close to the Czech city Hradec Králové, which is historically also known as Königgrätz. There we have a source by Michael Hubert, who wrote that there in the Elbe were so many salmon that the river could barely accommodate them, and the people came with axes to slay them. Going on to the Weser system, near Kassel in the river Fulda. And there we have a source by Winkelmann, who wrote that there was one day in that year where 802 salmon were caught in one go. And this was a very special occasion, so a reminder of this event was carved on a pillar at the entrance to the city's wine cellar. Now we make a bit of a bigger jump into the 17th and 18th century. close to Dessau in the river Mulde, which is part of the Elbe system, we have records of 12 years in the time between 1633 and 1775. And the source was a bit too long to include here in its entirety, so it's only an excerpt. But the records say that in the worst of those 12 recorded years, there were only a few hundred salmon caught. But in the good years, it was multiple thousand, with the best year being 1642 to 1643, where 4,904 fishes were caught. Now we go to the Oder system near Breslau in the 1700s. And Hubert wrote in this year that at the beginning of the century, there were often 300 to 500 salmon caught in the springtime. However, he then mentions that those numbers went down after they built high weirs in Lower Silesia. And I find it very interesting that they already then saw a clear connection between the numbers of salmon and obstacles in their migration routes. The last historic point I want to visit with you is 1783 in the Rhine by Niederspey. Wenck wrote in this year about the salmon fishing in this area. And he mentions how much the fishers had to pay the lords per salmon and how much money the lords had earned through those payments until St. Jacob's Day, which is the 25th of July. And doing the math, we can find out that the fishers in Darmstadt alone had caught 12,000 salmon in only 7 months. So with these few examples, we can already see that the salmon in Germany once could be found in many parts. However, only 200 years later, that was it. In the 1950s, the salmon became extinct in the Rhine, Elbe, and Weser system. And by the mid-1980s, it was also gone in the Oder system. And this was despite early stocking efforts that took place in all of these rivers in the late 19th century. The factors for the extinction of Atlantic salmon in Germany are many of the same that we see today in other parts of the world. Chemical pollution, thus bad water quality, obstruction in migration routes, loss of spawning areas, overfishing, and habitat degradation. I do not want to go into too much detail about any of these factors, but I do want to show you one diagram and a couple of pictures that, relating to these factors, that made a huge impression on me. The diagram is this one, which can be found in a paper by Lenders et al., which is about the relation of the historical rise of hydropower and the collapse of salmon stocks. So the diagram shows how the cumulative number of watermills in the Dutch, Belgian, and German part of the Rhine catchment increased, and how the percentage of salmon decreased rapidly over the same time. So if we start from about 1200, then the salmon population had decreased by about 99% in 1900. The picture that I wanted to show you is this beautiful painting by Peter Biermann from 1819, and it's called Blick vom Isteiner Klotzrhein aufwärts gegen Basel. And it shows the Rhine, as can be seen from this rock formation, which is called the Isteiner Klotz, toward Basel. And well, as you can see, the Rhine there was a complex floodplain wetland mosaic with intersecting side channels offering an expansive habitat. And now I show you a recent picture with a similar view showing the same rock formation. Can anyone spot the Rhine? So it's up there, very small in the top right-hand corner. So we can see it changed completely. The wetlands have been dried out and the river has been straightened. The last thing I want to show you is that action is being taken in Germany and in its surrounding countries. So here are some projects, both state as well as private projects from anglers, which are being carried out to help reintroduce the Atlantic salmon. This is probably not a complete list of projects, but it's nevertheless good to see that some action is being taken. And in general, it's very important to work together and also to have industry leaders and politicians involved in those efforts in order to secure the rescue and also the survival of salmon for the future. So here I want to thank Stefan Ludwig from Wanderfische ohne Grenzen and ASF Germany, who supported me with information for the presentation and also provided me with the picture from the Rhine that he took himself. And yeah, thank you all for your attention.
Do you want to take a seat? Okay. Thank you. I'm going to invite, please, Fawn and Elle to come on stage and we'll have a chat. Thank you. And I'm looking at my phone, not for rudeness, but to keep time. I didn't bring my watch with me, so forgive me if you see me looking at my phone. Lara, I thought that was just fascinating. I have to admit, I did not realize that the salmon were extinct in Germany. The Rhine was absolutely beautiful. The picture, I mean, it just is a completely different thing. I've seen the Rhine and I've visited, but it's a completely different thing compared to what it is now.
It is, yeah, and it's quite sad to see. And I'm sure it's similar in many other countries in the world. I know that there's also, for example, from the Elbe, there are also some pictures where you can see them from like 200 years ago. And if you go to the same spots today, it's the same as with the picture, like painting and picture that I showed. It's just a completely different area and landscape. And I guess seeing it like this, it's not surprising that not just the salmon, but so many other species like animals as well as plants and so on are like struggling or extinct.
Exactly. Can you talk a little bit about what efforts are being made in Germany, if at all, in terms of trying to rejuvenate or make alive again that cultural connection that would have been there in the past between people and salmon? I mean, obviously the job of work is to get the salmon back in the rivers, but alongside that, parallel to that, to get people to feel again.
Well, I guess considering like how there's a culture, I would say in the UK also with the salmon, or of course with the Native Americans and so on, I don't think there was ever the chance for a culture like that to build, because while we still had the salmon, it was primarily a food source. Yeah, and I'm not sure if there's like much work in terms of building this culture for now. It's more trying to reintroduce the salmon, and then once that's happened and worked out, maybe then there's the chance to create a culture.
Elle, I think what you spoke about, I mean, you can take the model of what you are doing in Findhorn and actually apply it everywhere. The idea that you're trying to reawaken that connection between people and place, context and nature. Can you talk a little bit about, this amazing phrase you said, cultural darning and mending, and the study that was done to kind of bring these pieces of music alive again? I mean, it was extremely moving, but can you talk a little bit about how it is possible to take what you've done, for example, and apply it to, I mean, potentially any place in the world? I mean, it's the same kind of challenge, isn't it?
Is this working? Yeah, great.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the sense that we all come from watersheds, and I think maybe what you're speaking to, Lara, is that in Europe and in the kind of colonial area of Europe, we've kind of been so far removed from our indigenous cultures for such a long time that you're having to dig quite deep to find these threads to reconnect to. And that phrase, cultural darning and mending, is very much a Runich and Murray's claim, and it's a really exquisite way of talking about something that is, it's not really in your face, but it's just remembering that there is all this stuff underpinning the way that culture has evolved, and all we need to do is really sort of give the time and space and the research to look back and find it, to bring it back into the modern day, and it becomes very practical quite quickly. We are building relationships back with place and the sense of belonging, and therefore the care that comes with it. But as I was saying, the practical implementation of knowing where species once were is really useful when it comes to designing schemes. And I'm here with my colleague Guy, who's the trees and the peatland fellow, and I keep saying, well, look at the Gallic map too and see what was there and how can that be integrated within designs that we're putting on the ground.
And you say we need to go back quite far, but what I took from your presentation was actually you scratch the surface and you soon find place names that tell you things, songs that are there. You can create that sort of connection quite quickly, can't you? I mean, it's not that long ago when, I talk about Ireland, but it's not that long ago when salmon were in our waters, and that connection would have been there a lot stronger.
Yeah, I think it's only, if we look at these interdependent crises, if we're looking at a polycrisis, and capitalism is very much connected to the nature and climate crisis, and if you just tug on one thread, you quite quickly are connecting to all the different things. And I think that, songs and stories are one way to reach for that sense of connection, but there are many other things we can pull at that would start bringing us back to that subject.
Fawn, I suppose it's an obvious thing to say, but when you talk about extinction, you lose so much more than the species that's in front of you.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to say, listening to the presentation was very emotional for me. Even just reacting to what I saw take place in Germany, that was the reality of what I was confronted with as a young president back in 2006 and 2007. I had mentioned just 2 years into my presidency, I found I couldn't have a conversation. But what really drove the Quinault Nation to go out to the international community was a visual, very much like the painting. I was told, well, first of all, let me back up. From an indigenous perspective, we look 7 generations out and we look at the world broadly. And so 150 years ago is 7 generations. So if you think of everyone's ancestors in this room 150 years ago, the songs, the prayers, the relationships that they fostered exist in your DNA today. And so that is why it is so easy to just reawaken it. It's in your DNA, it's just below the surface. And so for us, the idea that we would lose connection with our salmon, I set out to have a community-driven agenda as the president. What are the top priorities of our community? And one would think it would be jobs, economy, social services, etc. The top priority in our community the year I got elected was restoring our blueback salmon. And so it was that marching order that led me to understand and question, why have we gone from millions of sockeye in the Quinault River in the 1950s and 60s to only 3,000 the year I got elected? I saw a visual and a graph. I saw the ocean temperature spike and an overlay of the decline since 1950. It mirrored it. Every time the ocean temperature spiked, we had a sharp decline. And so we let science drive that agenda. And I remember, as Dieter said this morning, telling our Quinault citizens, I do not want to be the last generation that experiences a prize blueback sockeye salmon returning to the Quinault. I don't want to be part of that generation that explains to future generations how rich it tasted, how abundant it was. And so when we looked at a visual of our river system historically, it looked very much like that painting. There were mature trees. There were places where there was a lot of shade and temperature regulation. But at the turn of the century, there wasn't the development that you saw in the second picture. What we saw was widespread clear cutting of logging practices that just wiped out those mature trees. And so our river system would whip wildly to the north and south with no stability. So we put together engineered log jams to stabilize the river system, planting mature conifer trees that are now stabilizing and restoring that first image in that first picture. And we saw mature tree systems in Alaska. We thought that's the goal. And so that motivated us to the point of we have to really connect with that history and let science drive, and let our oral traditions drive, honor those that have gone before us, but also ensure that we have that sense of urgency to ensure the salmon stock remain for 7 generations out. And so I thank you. That really brought back home to me just how deep this issue is, because seeing the image and taking a screenshot of when those salmon became extinct, it's unimaginable. It's hard for me to even comprehend that in our systems.
Lara, when you were looking at this history, I mean, were you shocked by what you found? Is the salmon spoken about in schools in Germany? Is it something that has any relevance to people's sort of conversations or anything like that?
No, as I said, I was very surprised the first time I heard that we actually had salmon in Germany. And since I found that out, I talked to a lot of my friends and people and were like, oh, did you actually know there were salmon in the Rhine? And like people my age, they all don't know it. So it's like been lost in time already that we actually even had that fish in our systems.
And Elle, did you find in the project in Findhorn, I mean, in as much as you can say that as there was that kind of reawakening of the cultural connections, that, I mean, can you measure the impact it has? Can you have any sense of whether it changes people's minds and, most importantly, I suppose, urgently creates action?
It's a great question. We are trying to measure these things as we go, and I think it maybe links to a bigger issue in this space, because where with sort of scientific action, kind of practical action, you can have metrics which are quantifiable. This is very much more of an experiential, relational, qualitative piece of the work, and therefore also that soft stuff is harder to fund. So we are trying to figure out good ways to measure the outcomes, essentially, and have lots of testimonials. And Ranach and Mary are bringing their research downstream. We've got a second phase underway, and the research is going online. But just a couple of weeks ago, on Julie Fallis's new album, if you don't know Julie Fallis, she's quite a sort of big deal in the Gaelic singing world. She's put one of these songs of the tributary where the source of the River Findhorn is on her new album. And so there's this kind of reach that's also happening. And I feel like, the kind of the threads that come and extend from this work will reveal themselves over time, but we are seeing that in the bit of data that we've gathered initially in the upper catchment community, at least, the sense of connection to the river is being kind of rekindled through the songs and the stories that people are connecting to and wanting to be able to play and kind of, bring back to life.
And to then shift decision-making and enhance advocacy, I presume, along the way. Fawn, there was a mention there of harder to fund. I mean, these intangibles, the value of nature is intangible. The reality of trying to protect nature is funding and having to say, we spent X amount of money and this was the result. So how do those two things marry, or do they? How do you find a way that you can, for example, in Germany, reawaken a sense of connection and relevance between the salmon and young people, older people, whatever? How can you do that? Because it is hard, as Elle was saying, to get funding for those things.
Yes, I think one of the things that we've found to be quite successful, if you look at the hat that I'm wearing in this image, that was gifted to me on my very first tribal journey, canoe journey. So I'm a member of our ocean-going societies. And I believe that when funders and others see nature through our lens in a very powerful and spiritual way, it becomes so much more than just dollars and cents. There's a strength and a resilience to that. There's a reason why the United States set out to destroy our cultures, our songs, our dances, our ceremonies, our language. There's tremendous power in that. We are incredibly strong and powerful as Indigenous peoples who stand on centuries of knowledge and wisdom. And growing up, I did not have the ability to speak our language. I'm learning our language. I did not have the ability to get into a canoe, an ocean-going canoe, out into the Pacific. But I'm telling you, when that experience happened, I launched off the coast of Quinault to set out to paddle our canoe to Quileute. If any of you have seen the movie Twilight, Quileute tribe is our neighboring tribe. And about 10 minutes into the tribal journey, I was about ready to give up. I couldn't pull that canoe. I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this for 9 hours in 14-foot swells, and you're off the coast of the Pacific. And these aren't canoes that are manufactured in a factory. These are hand-carved canoes from old cedar trees. And I wanted to give up, but I had a canoe full of young people, 10-year-olds, and I thought, I'm the president. I can't quit in front of these kids and have the support boat come get me out of the canoe. And about 10 minutes in, our elder, and I'm getting goosebumps describing this right now, an elder began to sing some of our traditional songs that have been sung out on the Pacific for centuries. And it's as though my mind and my body physically resigned and my spirit came to life. And I felt this extraordinary strength. And as the ocean waves came to our canoe, I would anticipate it and just effortlessly pull a 2,000-pound canoe with young people in it. And our elders sang these songs that are timeless. And it's as though my physical body resigned, my spirit came to life, and I began to dance with the ocean. And that is something that historically we hold and we share as Indigenous peoples that is very powerful. And just like the Indigenous peoples of North America, of Central South America, the Pacific, we have all those traditions. Every one of us are indigenous to planet Earth. Every one of us have sacred ties that go back for centuries where there's tremendous power in those relationships. But when we start to view nature through a lens of sort of this dominance, and Chief Seattle said it so pointedly, humanity is but one strand in a very complex web of life. What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. And so it really is for us to understand with all humility our proper place in planet Earth and with nature, and ultimately with our spirituality, because many have described upon European contact, Indigenous peoples were primitive and we were savages. But if you think of people like Abraham Maslow and Stephen Covey that talk about a hierarchy of maturity, at the very base are selfish people, self-centered, self-serving individuals. At the next level, you have independent people. At the highest levels of maturity, you have interdependence. And Indigenous people were not only interdependent relative to our fellow humanity, we are interdependent relative to all things living, and ultimately interdependent with our Creator that we saw in every living thing. And so, yes, educating, back to your question. Back to your question, just modeling that and stepping into that timeless centuries of knowledge and wisdom that we all carry. And then as elected officials, as public servants, understanding that we are here to serve 7 generations out. And for those that do wrong, they must be held accountable. We need bold, strategic, inclusive, and decisive climate action to honor all of our positions. And we don't need to be elected officials. Every single one of us can step into a leadership role to honor those relationships.
And we were listening because we obviously have a huge amount to learn from Indigenous communities in being able to understand all of this. We have a few minutes left. If there's any questions, just wave at me and we'll put some questions the speakers. Lara, in Germany, in a broader way about nature restoration, are there interesting initiatives, political or not, that are happening to reawaken that connectedness, to reawaken that sort of intangible connection that we have to nature?
To reawaken the intangible?
Are there interesting initiatives in Germany in terms of trying to connect people more to the kind of restoration, for example, to bring the salmon back? Are you seeing a movement of people coming through or not?
I would say, I don't know if it's like political. I think as also been said before, I think it's as often like those anglers that have the connection to the water already, who then take the initiative to do something, and those angling clubs then also try to connect with the people around their areas and try to get people or children also, also to experience, I guess, nature and the river and so on, and then try to do something. So I don't know about political ones, but yeah.
Elle, it seems that also our language, it's interesting, I do it all the time, the idea that nature is here and we're here. And I know there's a whole initiative to try and get us to talk about we are all it. It isn't separate, but we're all it, and that we need to remind ourselves of that and have humility in terms of our place in nature.
Yeah, I mean, that basically completely underpins my motivations to set the project up in the first place. And I think even the languaging around nature connection is unhelpful because it creates that sense that we need to connect to something that is really what we are. But yeah, we are in the unfortunate position where the different systems and societal constructs have created this sense of distance, and it's about sort of remembering and reconnecting to that interdependence which underpins life on Earth. This isn't some kind of woo-woo thing. This is the basis of science. All the molecules that make all of us were made in the heart of a dying star, and yet here we are, these multicellular organisms that can reflect on the fact that we've become disconnected from nature. So that's completely mental.
It is. We've a quantum physics at the end you can talk about that.
So if we could get out of the way a bit and sort of, realize that what we're talking about here is life-supporting systems. The fact that we're kind of debating the hows and why-fors and where the money's going to come from and who might say no, I think that time should really be over. We should all just be getting on with it and working together.
I mean, so much, in some ways, of what needs to happen is us just not doing things, isn't it?
Yeah, you can put it that way.
Fawn, to finish, can you talk a little bit about the power of storytelling? We've heard it mentioned before, and Elle mentioned it as well. I know in Ireland, when I was younger, we used to always hear the story of what's called the Bradán Fasa, the salmon thief, and it was about the salmon of knowledge, and it's a very, very powerful story. My 3 children have yet to be told it in schools, but up until I don't know when, we were all told it, and it really imbued a sense of the salmon being something extremely important, extremely valuable, but also just full of wisdom and knowledge. And I don't know whether that's slipping away, but it was a very memorable and powerful story to tell. And I just wonder also now how much storytelling should be part of trying to re-engage people with the purpose of this.
Yes, it's absolutely foundational. I had mentioned Billy Frank Jr., my longtime mentor, who said the salmon cannot get out of the rivers and ocean to defend themselves. That's our sacred duty. He had a saying, and it was just educate, 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 and stay the course and tell our stories. We constantly have to tell our stories and educate. And I think it's really important, and I really appreciated this morning having the young people, because these are multi-generational issues, we have to have a seamless transition of leadership. A 15-year-old today is going to be 25 and college educated in just 10 years. And so it's important to not only have that transition seamless in terms of leadership, policy, but those foundational stories that really bring to life the why we do all these things, because that's central to who we are. And we can't let another generation pass without reawakening, reviving centuries of knowledge and wisdom in every community. That's what it's going to take for us to truly confront the existential threat of the climate crisis. And I think it's also important, not only looking back in the rearview mirror, every single day we see incredible stories happening today in real time, that we must capture those stories for the next generation to look back. What did people do in the year 2025? There's some pretty powerful and incredible stories that we can all share out individually, but more importantly, collectively. And when I reflect on our leadership in the 18 years I served, early in our presidency, we knew that we had to hold industry accountable to price carbon. There is not a carbon pricing mechanism. There wasn't in the state of Washington, and we took a ballot initiative out to the citizens. It was called I-1631. The Western States Petroleum Association dropped $33 million to kill this campaign. It was the largest campaign in Washington state history. We wrote 10% of carbon revenues into that citizen initiative. After it was defeated, we came back and passed the Climate Commitment Act. And this last year, we drove $2 billion into the Washington state economy, of which $25 million went to repatriate some of our lands at Quinault that were taken by logging companies. And we're moving one of our villages to higher ground. Now, we didn't wait around for anyone to do that. We went after industry. We knew industry had to be held accountable. They needed to pay a price, and we needed those precious resources because we lack time. And so that in and of itself, do our kids know about it's really a Herculean,
to put it mildly, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Effort. And every single one of us are taking on things that are humanly impossible to do individually, but collectively, we're making it happen. And we're living in challenging times, but with challenging times come incredible opportunity. We need to bring our young people right along side by side with us to share that, because it is that collective strength and power that's really going to help us seize this moment and opportunity.
Well, Lara, thank you very much for what you have stimulated in this very interesting talk that you gave. Finally, are you hopeful about the salmon's prospects in Germany? Don't leave too good picture for a guy.
I'd like to be so. So, as I said, there's many different projects going on, and as always, some are more successful than others. Yes. But there are numbers of salmon coming back from those reintroduction programs. I do think there's a lot of challenges that we still need to solve or tackle. But if we all work together, I'm sure something can be done.
Absolutely. Lara, Fawn, and Elle, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, that was fabulous. Thank you, Lara. Thank you so much. Do you want to take that? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end on a hopeful, positive, and I don't know, a little bit of light in the room note about thriving wild salmon at the heart of healthy ecosystems. You'll be glad to know. We know that they're in crisis, but there are lots of fantastic things happening, and it's really important that we hear them and repeat them and then try and replicate them as well. So I'm very happy to first introduce Dr. Guðni Guðbergsson, who's Marine and Freshwater Research Institute, is from the Marine and Freshwater Institute in Iceland, and he's going to talk about the thriving wild salmon and habitat in Iceland. He was brought up on a farm in the southwest of Iceland before moving to Reykjavik and studying freshwater biology, and he works on Atlantic salmon populations in his country and has published widely on it. So I'm really looking forward to this talk about what's going on in Iceland and why it is so positive. Please put your hands together for Dr. Guðbergsson.
Thank you for the introduction. First, I would like to thank for the opportunity to be here today. My talk is a little bit different from the previous ones. As a content of my talk, I'm going to come into the important steps for the management of salmon stocks in Iceland, the role of anglers to keep salmon fisheries, salmon rivers in health state, status of salmon stocks in Iceland, new risk factors for salmon, and a little bit about a view to the future. In Iceland, we have 5 native species of freshwater fish. We have the Atlantic salmon, Arctic char, brown trout, European eel, we have the sticklebacks, rainbow trout introduced for aquaculture purposes, and we have increasing numbers of pink salmon migrating into our rivers now quite recently. All the freshwater fish species either need or can live in the ocean as a part of their life cycle. Some important steps. In the first complete written law in the 12th century states that rivers should be passable to allow fish to migrate through the whole river system from the ocean to the upper regions. So at that time, salmon was an important food resource, and they also had some clue about their life cycle. Fishing in Iceland, fishing rights go with adjacent land and cannot be sold separately. Ocean fishery for salmon was banned in 1932. Landowners of each river system have by law to form fishery associations that manages the fishing rights within the frame of the law that states sustainable fishery. Fishing rights are usually leased for rod and line fishery. The price of rod fishing licenses is decided on open market, with licenses going to syndicates, anglers or angling clubs paying the highest bid. Cost and benefit from the fishery is divided between owners by the part or share of the river based of the land length, size of nursery area, and catch. Income from the salmon fishery is of high importance for communities in rural areas that are mainly farmers. For the management, there is a limited number of rods allowed in each river. At the average, dating back as an historic conservation limit, dating back to 1970, that the number of rods should be decided on the catch and 1 fish per rod per day. So if there was a 200 fish caught annually, then 2 rods, 500, 5 rods, etc. The fishing season for Atlantic salmon is maximum 105 days, and 90 days is the most common, from 20th of May throughout September. And rod fishery is allowed for 12 hours a day with a midday break, and fish, or two-winter fish over 69 centimeters are to be released in rivers with fly fishery that accounts for most rivers. In Iceland, we have approximately 100 salmon rivers, and that are located in lowland areas. And in West Iceland, 40% of the total salmon catch is in river in that area. And the composition of the catches show that there is higher proportion of two-winter fish in the north and eastern rivers than in southwestern rivers. And on the picture we can see the difference between glacier rivers and clearwater rivers, and of course the angling opportunities in glacier rivers are poor. Iceland is geologically young country with several waterfalls, and approximately 1/3 of the rivers open for fish migration have been opened by construction of fish ladders that gives larger fish stocks, increasing fishing opportunities, and most of the fish ladders were built during the 1960s and 1970s. And here we are just two examples of fish ladders. So a little bit about the 100 years of angling fishery in River Elliðár that is located in southwest Iceland and runs through the capital of Reykjavik. It is a high productive river, and in this picture here we can see King Christian X of Denmark and Iceland fishing in 1921. Here we have a picture of an angler in 1960, 1990, and then in present time. And we can see it is the same river, it is the same fish stock, the same fishing method. However, we see more trees in recent years. And we have indications of the status of stocks through a logbook system that dates back to 1946. And from 1974, we have information on individual fish caught in the angling fishery. The blue part of the graph is the catch landed, and we can see that the average catch in the period from 1974 is 42,000 salmon. The green part is catch and release, and the red part is from ocean rancing of smolts released in two branches of River Rangá in South Iceland, where there are good angling opportunities but poor nursery areas, so that the smolts are reared in hatcheries and released in releasing ponds. Net fishery took place in glacier rivers in Iceland, and it has decreased throughout the years. And one big step was taken in 1991 when there was an agreement made between net fishermen in the lower part of River Hvítá, that is a glacier river, and the fishing right owners in the tributaries to pay the net fishermen for not fishing. And this was done on a commercial basis, since the salmon was so much more valuable taken by rod than by nets. Iceland is located in the middle of the North Atlantic, and with an area of 103,000 square kilometers, and the ocean climate is different from South Iceland to North Iceland. And in the south, we have warm Atlantic water flowing from the south, and the polar water coming from the north. By looking into the temperature west of Iceland, at the time the smolts are migrating, in July, we can see a highly significant correlation between the temperature and the catch in the following year. And the forecast for 2025 lies somewhere down here, a little bit lower than 2024, if I'm correct. So we can still see connection between ocean climate and fish migrations. When we look into catches in rivers in the same area, like in West Iceland, we can see that they fluctuate together, and we see higher fluctuations between years in the later years than in the previous part of the time series. And if we look into Northeast Iceland, we see that there has been an increase in later years due to catch and release, improving the spawning stock and the production. Because of the ban on ocean fishery for salmon, we didn't have much information about the migration of Icelandic salmon. However, we had tag recoveries from the Greenland fishery when it was operating, and also from the Greenland fishery and the Faroes fishery when it was operating, showing that higher proportion of salmon from North Iceland were migrating eastward and from West Iceland westward towards Greenland. In 2009, mackerel started migrating into Icelandic waters, and a mackerel fishery was opened with pelagic trawls. And at that time, the Directorate of Fisheries started monitoring bycatch of salmon in the mackerel fishery, and showing bycatch of at the average 5.5 salmon per 1,000 tons taken of mackerel. We had some tag recoveries from the fishery showing tagged fish coming from Ireland and Western Norway into our waters. And genetic analysis shows that only 5% of the salmon caught as bycatch were from Iceland, the rest from the British Isles and southern Scandinavia. And fortunately, mackerel is not migrating into our waters anymore, so the salmon can swim and feed there freely nowadays. About the anglers. There are several anglers coming to fish in Icelandic rivers every year, and anglers, famous or not, when they are at the riverbank, they all look the same. And salmon stocks get value and a price tag through the income from selling fishing licenses, and anglers have strong voice, and it is of importance to prevent impacts from hydropower dams, from aquaculture, and so forth. So, yeah, it's good to have a strong voice from different sources. Recent threats for Atlantic salmon in Iceland, we can see climate change. We see higher temperature during winter time, spring and autumn. That means rivers are ice-free for a longer period during winter, allowing predators to open water. And however, summer temperature does not show an increase, at least not yet. There is a potential threat on impact from aquaculture, genetic impact from fish farm escapees, and the stock that is used in net pens in Iceland is a Norwegian farmed fish that is different from Icelandic salmon stocks, but that also gives the possibility to distinguish between Icelandic salmon and the Norwegian farmed fish if escaped fish are detected and caught in our rivers. Pink salmon are migrating into our rivers in increasing numbers and increasing in distribution, and we have seen evidences of recruitment in our rivers. And a view to the future, and it is of importance to protect water quality, protect river habitat, management of fish stocks above conservation limits, impact assessment for all enhancement activities. Stock rebuilding takes time. We have seen stocks going down to low level, and it can take up to 20 years for them to recover again. And it is our responsibility to protect and manage our fish stocks in a sustainable way. And by that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank Thank you so much, Guðni. And that map of Ireland, the Bundoraha River beside the Delphi, it's one of the last remaining rivers with a juvenile freshwater pearl mussel, which of course depend on salmon, and it's an absolute gem of a place if anyone would like a little trip to the west of Ireland ever. There's a little notice here for all of you if anyone has any queries about tomorrow's banquet. I've been told to tell you to go down to the registration desk downstairs and ask to speak to Alison. Just don't do it all at once for fear of overloading her, but talk to Alison about any queries that you have. I'm going to hand back to Mark after the next session, and he's going to have some words with you, and I will see you tomorrow morning. But I'm really looking forward to hearing about the recovery of the Tyne now with Dr. Jack Bloomer from the Tyne Rivers Trust. Jack lives and works on the Tyne in northeast England, which is a waterway known as the best salmon river in England. And he works as Deputy CEO of the Tyne Rivers Trust, where he develops and delivers projects to improve the biodiversity of the catchment. He has a PhD on the environmental stressors experienced by salmon during incubation, and he continues to carry out research across the world. And he also represents the National Rivers Trust on the technical steering group of the Missing Salmon Alliance and the accredited NGOs on the scientific advisory group at NASCO. So please put your hands together for Dr. Bloomer.
Thanks, Ella. So I'm here, I'm representing Tyne Rivers Trust, and we are one of the 67 regional rivers trusts that Mark mentioned earlier. Obviously I'm biased, but I think we've got one of, if not the most interesting story to tell when it comes to salmon certainly across England. And that's because up until really relatively recently, salmon numbers on the Tyne really were relatively on their knees. But through the right action being taken, they've shown a really remarkable recovery. And that's really the message that I want to see being taken away. Once I've finished talking, I hope that's the message, is that once we do the right thing by salmon, then they will respond. So, as a brief background to salmon, I don't think anybody needs that. A brief background to the Tyne catchment. There we are, we're right up in the northeast of England. We cover an area of about 3,000 square kilometres. Our catchment can broadly be divided into about 3 equal-sized parts. There's the North Tyne catchment, which starts up on the border with Scotland. There's the South Tyne catchment that starts down in Cumbria. And those two catchments, they're very rural, they're very sparsely populated. But then they flow and they meet a town called Hexham, and then they flow out to the North Sea as the main River Tyne. And the main River Tyne flows through much more urban hubs, most notably Newcastle and Gateshead. And like any urbanised river, it's been really heavily impacted by human activity and most notably industry and shipping. And that's still going on today. And that's really what a lot of people, particularly outside of this room and outside of our sort of work bubble, would think of the Tyne. And these are a few examples of what people would think of when they think of the Tyne. If you ask them, they'd probably start thinking about, those urban hubs and the nightlife of Newcastle. They'd go back a few decades, a few centuries maybe, and start thinking about the coal industry and the heavy, really, really heavy industry that was operating from Newcastle. They'd probably maybe look more favourably on the bridges and the quite spectacular architecture that there is down on the quayside of Newcastle and Gateshead. And then, of course, they'd start to talk about Newcastle United, Paul Gascoigne, and then inevitably Fog on the Tyne. We run an annual photo competition at Tyne Rivers Trust, and we get about 5 to 10 entries a year called Fog on the Tyne. And if you don't understand that reference, I'd really encourage you not to look into it any further. But one thing that's really missing from that picture that I think is absolutely vital and is obviously hugely important, and I'll focus on from now on, I promise, is salmon. So salmon is hugely important to the Tyne, and the Tyne is hugely important for salmon across the UK. In England and Wales, between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the rod-caught salmon are caught on the Tyne every year. So it's hugely important for the species. That obviously makes it hugely important culturally for the region, and we've already heard about the economics. So if you think about those really sparsely populated catchments of the North and South Tyne, where actually employment is few and far between, we estimate the presence of salmon in our rivers contributes around £4 million a year to the economy and 150 jobs. So its presence is really, really critical. But it hasn't always been that way. So this graph here, it goes back 70 years to 1950, and it's showing salmon rod catch on the Tyne throughout that time. And you can see from about the 1950s to around the early 80s, we were getting really very, very few salmon being caught on the river. But then we really start to see this remarkable recovery happen. So we want to have a sort of look into what drove this recovery. And really the sort of two confounding factors, two conflicting factors, and the argument about which of these two factors drove the recovery will continue. I don't have time to get into it today, fortunately from my perspective. But the first one was the Control of Pollution Act, and that was introduced in 1974. And that allowed for much stronger regulation around polluting activities of our waterways. Basically meant that the amount of sewage that was being discharged into rivers and the impact of our industry on our rivers was now going to be much more strictly regulated. And that coincided with the construction of a major sewage works that intercepted previously untreated sewage that was previously flowing into the Tyne estuary from Newcastle and Gateshead, and also the decline of industry. But then 5 years later, in 1979, Kielder Hatchery opened, and that also played a role in the recovery of salmon on the Tyne. And as I say, these two factors did both in combination contribute to this recovery. Now, as I said, I don't have time to get into which of these factors played the biggest role. So due to their sort of its broader applicability, and its applicability today, I'm going to sort of chicken out and focus on the Control of Pollution Act. And I think that's really best exemplified through this graph here. So this graph I've stolen from some work that Nigel Milner did back in 2004. And this shows, this starts back in 1974, so that's when the Control of Pollution Act was first introduced and comes through to 2004. And what this is showing is oxygen levels in the Tyne estuary. And the solid dots are showing water samples taken from the surface of the estuary, and the hollow dots are those taken from the bottom of the estuary. And you can see from 1974 until about around 1984, we were regularly getting oxygen levels down to around 0. Now you've got to remember that every salmon returning to spawn on the Tyne has got to swim through this water. So it's absolutely no surprise that we were getting massive fish kills, and we were getting such low numbers of salmon returning to spawn in the upper reaches of the river. But then, once you start to look at the mid-80s onwards, we do start to see this really steady increase in oxygen levels in the estuary. And we're obviously starting to see much better conditions for returning salmon. And once we overlay salmon rod catch from that previous graph I showed, you see this really remarkable correlation between oxygen levels in the estuary and that salmon rod catch. And that just shows that this Control of Pollution Act, alongside the construction of that sewage treatment works and the decline of the industry, led to that improvement of water quality. It drove the increase in oxygen levels, and it led to the improvement in salmon numbers on the Tyne. And I think what's really important to point out at this stage is that this pattern is not totally unique to the Tyne. We've got neighbouring rivers, particularly to the south of us, on the Tees and the Wear, that show a very similar pattern to this. It's on a slightly smaller scale, but that's due to the geographies of the catchment. So it just shows the importance of that legislation, and that when we act, salmon will respond. And that's true more locally and more recently. So this example here is, so this map on the left is obviously a zoomed in map of the Tyne catchment, and the area highlighted in blue is a catchment known as the River Derwent. Now the River Derwent is a really interesting river. I really like it. It's almost like a microcosm of the Tyne catchment as a whole. Its lower 10 kilometres is almost, it is very urbanised, and then its upper 20 kilometres is much more rural, with lovely moorland streams providing great spawning habitat for salmon and sea trout. But like the rest of the Tyne, it's suffered enormously from industrial activity over such a long period of time. So that image in the top right there, that's a weir that was built more than 300 years ago to power a paper mill. And that's more than 2 meters high. So for the entire time that that was present, it was acting as an almost complete barrier to migratory fish. But much more recently, in the bottom right, that's Concert Steelworks that closed down in 1980. And that had a devastating impact on the water quality of the Derwent. And it almost got into this continuous cycle where it was polluting the river, killing all the brown trout in it. Then they paid for it to be restocked with brown trout. Then it would pollute the river again, kill all those trout, then restock it again. And that went on until it did close down in 1980. And obviously when it did close down, there were really devastating economic consequences for the region, and it's important to recognise that. But it did give an opportunity for the river to recover. And that's exactly what happened. And we started to see brown trout numbers recovering naturally. But salmon were not coming back, and the reason for that was the presence of these 5 pretty enormous weirs, each of which were totally impassable to salmon and sea trout. And basically nobody had acted to address any of these because of the water quality on the river had been so poor. But now there was clear recognition that the water quality was sufficient to support salmon. So we got together with the Environment Agency, the Marine Management Organisation, local authorities, and crucially, those local communities that were really devastated by the closure of those steelworks were hugely supportive of this work. And one by one, we started to tackle these barriers to migratory fish in 2010. And we worked upstream and eventually mitigated the most upstream barrier in 2019. And gradually, we've started to find salmon coming back. Up until in the last couple of years, just through electrofishing surveys, we've started to find salmon in the most upstream reaches of the catchment. So again, very recently, we're giving examples how when you do the right thing by salmon, they will respond. But I guess the picture still is not overall rosy for the Tyne, so I need to come back to this last graph. We are starting to see numbers again of returning salmon decline. So there's obviously a need to start delivering this work at bigger scale, more urgently, and with greater investment. But the Tyne is clearly an example that when we do the right thing at the right scale, then salmon will respond. Thank you. Thank you.
Right, I'm between you and a glass of something cold and bubbly, so I'm going to keep this brief. First of all, thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to Elle for moderating so brilliantly today. I know you had good material to work with, but you have excelled, so thank you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in action again tomorrow. Thanks to our inspirational speakers. From the words of encouragement by His Majesty the King, to Constantinos, Nada, and Emily and their colleagues, setting the challenge for us for this conference, and what we need to meet so that salmon have a future, whether in the Atlantic or the Pacific. And as Scott Schuyler said, they really have the clarity of youth, so we really need to listen to them today. The first step in realizing their challenge was the recognition that salmon are an important component of our cultural heritage. And as Fawn said, we're all indigenous people of this planet, and we all have a responsibility. So wherever we hail from, we need to recognize the critical role they play in our natural capital and the opportunities our society and economies gain from nurturing them and the places they live. And as Sudhita mentioned in his keynote speech this morning, they matter to us as a society, not just for angling, as so eloquently put by Mark and Robert, but what they tell us about the wider world and its value to our societies and well-being. We heard about the state of our rivers and oceans, the complex challenges that salmon face across the Northern Hemisphere, along with the vital role that information plays in restoration. It is clear we need much more of this information and a stark reminder that we do not have the luxury of time. As lest we forget, as we learned from Lara, what happens to a country when it loses its salmon. Perhaps that's a lesson our politicians, our UK politicians, might want to think about tomorrow when they're considering the water bill at Westminster. Perhaps more importantly, today we heard about the real-life success stories that can give us hope for the future of salmon and the inspirational and passionate people making this happen. Elle, Jack, I mean you too, okay? You've shown us the power of cold, clean water and what that really translates to for salmon. Guðni, I think you're encouraging a lot of people to become very interested in Iceland and the work that you're doing out there. I'm going to give the last word to Fawn. She told us to be bold and to seize the moment. So can I ask you to take that forward as we go through next door for drinks? So I hope you've enjoyed today, found it informative, and are feeling inspired by the opportunities to develop new partnerships and to discuss those partnerships over a drink, and then, crucially, to take action. Tomorrow, we're going to be focusing on environmental leadership, including contributions from the environment ministers of Norway, Scotland, and the United Kingdom, along with the commitments we all need to make to reduce human pressures, improve wild salmon survival at sea, and restore river catchments at pace and at scale. But for now, let's take that opportunity to share ideas, develop solutions over some drinks and canopies in the court drawing room, which is, so if you make your way back through those rear doors, there'll be something cold, wet, and bubbly for you. Thanks very much, and well done today.